Hello, I'm Charlie Reis, and this is Zhuangzi and the Experience of Excellence Implications for Educators as part of the Expertise Conference hosted by Helen King. My email is here, and I work at Xi'an Jiaotong-Liverpool University in Suzhou, China, which is just outside of Shanghai, or if China looks like a giant chicken to you, it's right in the breast of the chicken. And I want to start by saying, with the bottom paragraph here, that this is part of a larger project I'm involved with in trying to use classical Chinese knowledge to inform my job as an educational developer at my university because of our local context. And I think the whole process really enriches the conversations we can all have internationally about different approaches to thinking about development and all the issues therein. And part of the reason also is because we're a transnational university and we need to account for all of our different staff members and their backgrounds and such. So going to the top of the slide, I take a quote from Helen King that professional development is self-determined and it's varied. It has a range of activities. This particular paper or video grew out of the fact that in the November 2019 conference for CETA in Leeds, I went to a paper by Helen on expert practice. I was blown away by the scholarship, and I also was quite familiar with some of the descriptions of what practices were like through looking at Daoist philosophy. And so I'm bringing that back and sort of making that clear to everyone. So I want to say a big thank you at first to Helen, because this paper is the result of our correspondence over email about the similarities between the contemporary scholarship and what was written 5,000 years ago. So on to Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is a Daoist philosopher. He lived in the 4th century BC, and he's quite famous for these knack passages or ability passages, and they're very clearly models of expertise. And they're quite phenomenological. So they're about the experience of having the expertise or someone explaining it to someone else. And they're very ridiculous in a lot of ways and varied. We're going to hear about a guy who's slaughtering an ox, cook ding or butcher ding, which is the most famous knack passage. But there are also others of like some hunchback man who captures cicadas with a glue-tipped stick, or someone who makes bell stands, swimmers, et cetera, But I think Zhuangzi's point in using really strange examples is to show us that expertise lives everywhere, and you can find it if you look closely. So it's valid for teachers too. So as I said, butcher ding is the most famous allegory, and it's from chapter 3 of the Zhuangzi. This chapter is translated in various ways. Zipyorn translates it as the primacy of nourishing life. And Hansen, who wrote the entry on Zhuangzi in the Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy, calls it the most beautifully and elaborately expressed examples of skill in Zhuangzi. That's a sentiment that's common among scholars. It's a really, really beautiful piece and really odd and interesting. So I encourage all of you to look for this. You can find it online or in your library. And I will be using the Zipyorn translation from 2009 because I think it's philosophically quite interesting. And it seems quite true, as far as I can tell, without having much knowledge, to the original classical Chinese. So on to Wu Wei, which we're going to need to understand this. Wu Wei is maybe the unifying principle in warring states philosophy in China. So ancient Chinese thinking was really predicated by this idea of sort of purposeful inaction, doing, not doing. It really means not to act, literally. So Phillips has our literal translation. Then we get more sophisticated with Moon, purposeful inaction. Edward Slingerland says, oh, it can be effortless action, which is one description of expertise, perfected action, acting without acting, not exerting yourself, etc. It can also be thought of as flow, which will become relevant, or deliberative non-doing, or non-deliberative doing. So there are lots of translations, and this really does matter because the implications become quite confusing. But this is sort of the way or the model of what an expert or a sage or something or someone with expertise would do. So Wu Wei is really about the phenomenological state of the doer rather than the thing itself. And Slingerland here talks about this quote from Pang Pu and how the spiritual state in the moment of action that the person with expertise attains. And if you think about teaching, how some things are just intuitive, and how when we talk to expert practitioners, they really can sometimes not articulate what they've done that's so wonderful. They're just doing it because it's the right thing to do. So they're acting without purpose, or they're not necessarily thinking. And it's an old and very, very powerful notion, and hopefully I'll be using it in a variety of ways in the future as well. But for today, it's sort of the most heightened form of unconscious action. And so it would be the teacher that's just sort of naturally in the moment, in the room with everyone, or online with everyone, doing what's best for learning. So here we are, on to the story. The cook Ding, was carving up an ox for King Hui of Liang. So immediately, this seems to be official. The cook's near a king, and an ox is being ceremonially butchered to maybe consecrate a bell stand or something like this, or a ritual bell. Now the description. Whenever his hand smacked it, whenever his shoulder leaned into it, whenever his foot braced it, the thwacking tones of flesh falling from bone would echo. The knife would whiz through with its resonant thwing, each stroke ringing out the perfect note, attuned to the dance of the mulberry grove or the Jingshou chorus of the ancient sage kings. So what we're seeing here is a few things. First, I hope it's hilarious to you. This is like a cartoon, boom, bang description. We're getting sound effects in a philosophy book, which is quite odd. But we're also getting this very engaged practice where there's someone just going through in very graceful, quick, orderly movements without seeming to pause the task that they've been set to do. And if you look at the end there, it's the dance of the mulberry grove, which was a traditional rain dance that's quite ancient, or the dancing to the Jiangsu chorus. So we're seeing someone moving sort of musically and with rhythm, going through what they're supposed to be doing. And this is quite a strange description of butchery, I must say. And that's a lot of why I like it. It's cartoony. It's very clearly something special that's signaled by the king, but also just that it's a dance rather than an abattoir as such. And then we get the king again. Such wonderful skill can reach such heights. So it's all about the skill here, and I don't think it matters that it's butchery or anything else. I think it's hilarious that it's butchery, as I've said before, but that's more about Zhuangzi's personality as a thinker. And we're seeing here, though, yes, this is the sort of paragon of skill. And this is what the cook says about it. And what we're going to see here is a model of reflective practice and probably progressive problem solving. So the way this happens and unfolds in a few short sentences is worth paying attention to. So after the butchery and the king speaks, the cook puts down his knife and says, "What I love is the course," meaning the Tao, the way, something that advances beyond mere skill. So we know immediately it's not just that someone's good at something, there's something else here. And he says, when he first started cutting up oxen, all I looked at for 3 years was oxen. If you think about it, an ox is a huge, imposing animal. This wouldn't be a great thing to see. But look what he says next. And yet I was still unable to see all there was in an ox. To me, this points to progressive problem solving, more sophisticated viewing of whatever it is you're dealing with. So I very much like this passage in the beginning, and then it gets even more intense. But now I encounter it with my spirit rather than scrutinizing it with the eyes. My understanding consciousness, beholden to its specific purposes, comes to a halt, and thus the promptings of the spirit begin to flow. So if you think about the notion of flow in itself, or being in the zone, the expert that's unconsciously there already, that's what we're getting described to us. And we're seeing levels of it. That, okay, first there was just the activity, then there was more to see, and now there's sort of a spiritual union with the activity in itself. And again, it's even funnier that it's butchering an ox rather than something that's nice or tasteful to do. So here we are with some theory. According to Bereiter and Scardamalia's 1993 theory of the development of expertise, experts continually work at the edge of their competence by progressively problem solving. And in this case, I think that's seeing more of the ox. And the idea of seeing more isn't that your eyes change, but that you change in your phenomenological relationship to what you're doing in your repeated practices. So this would reach out to Schön or to Ericsson and Smith with their peak in the science of what is expertise performance. It's not just the years of experience, it's the reflection and the purposeful approach to doing things, to getting to flow in the spirit of things. So it's really, I think, if we think about the cook seeing the ox differently, using different mental representations that Ericsson often talks about to engage intuitively in an activity through deliberate practice. So, I already mentioned Schön, but we think this person, and we'll find out in a moment, that they've been cutting up oxen for 19 years. So that's the similar situation again and again. That's a site for deliberate practice. And it's allowed our cook to expand his repertoire and really develop himself to make his skill reach such heights. And so I think this approach is backed up by the literature, and we're seeing it, in an ancient text. And this is what, back to the Zhuangzi, he says, I depend on heaven's unwrought perforations and strike the larger gaps, following along with the broader hollows. I go by how they already are, playing them as they lay. So my knife has never had to cut through the knotted nodes where warmth hits the weave, much less the gnarled joints of bone. So again, the very visceral description, I think, is the writer having fun. However, this shows a mental picture and an understanding of how things go and what's smooth and where it's easy to flow rather than difficult. So I think when we're hearing the cook speak about the natural makeup of things, it's sort of following, or heaven's unwrought perforations would be another way to translate that. It's really about having learned from repeated performance and having reflected on it, so you have a model to use to get through the task you must get through. And this is what Ericsson and Poole say, again, from Peak, I believe, about mental representations, because I think they're here. And that's what he means by, I think, I go by they are, playing them as they lay, even though that's more literally, oh, I'm meeting something in my experience. Because you know where they're going to lay, you will be able to play them. So the same way that people, say, in chess can make faster, more accurate decisions and respond more quickly and effectively in a given situation, much like an expert teacher, so we're seeing this with Butcher Ding, and that's why I think we're seeing a very clear and entertaining model of expert practice. And then he says, a good cook changes his blade once a year. He slices. An ordinary cook changes his blade once a month. He hacks. I have been using the same blade for 19 years, cutting up thousands of oxen with it, and yet it's still as sharp as the day it came off the whetstone. So you could say maybe novice practice, let's say in education, is hacking at the thing. It's trying to get through. It's not satisfying and it's not smooth. Then it becomes more slicing and a little smoother. Finally, you might get to something like the practice of the mulberry dance, or dance of the mulberry grove, as we see with Cook Ding. So I want to relate this to Berliner's work on sort of progressive levels of skills. So hacking would be applying ideas without experience. An advanced beginner is modifying understanding through experience. Then someone who slices would be the competent practitioner. We're then going to see the final stages of Berliner in further descriptions from Zhuangzi, the proficient practitioner with intuition, and then the expert who acts fluidly because of their tacit knowledge and maybe mental representations I put in there too. So back to Zhuangzi. The joints all have spaces within them, and the very edge of the blade has no thickness at all. When what has no thickness enters into an empty space, it is vast and open, with more than enough room for the play of the blade. That's why my knife is still sharp, blah, blah, blah. So here, looking closely, seeing differently is what makes spaces larger or smaller. Oxen haven't changed, but it's the way that the butcher is interacting with oxen that has changed. And so things with no thickness suddenly have lots of space. And if you think about mental agility and professional or progressive problem solving, this is a really, really interesting model of that. And I really love the sort of Daoist notion of no thickness, therefore there's a vast space in emptiness, even in a small space. And thinking about being a teacher or a progressive problem solving in any arena, that's really where you're getting to. You're working on the smallest things so that everything is just as close to perfect as possible. And I also think this can be related to situated possibilities. And a lot of this comes from different resources. But the idea of professional development would be personal, because if it's situated in practice, it's defined by your practice and your discipline and what you choose to focus on. So, you're not totally constrained, yet you're not choosing everything. You're growing into the role that you have, and finding places there through the situated possibilities to progressively problem solve and to initiate deliberate practice, the way Ericsson might describe it. Now, we're coming to the end of the Zhuangzi piece, but I really like this part. Nonetheless, whenever I come to a clustered tangle, realizing that it is difficult to do anything about it, I instead restrain myself as if terrified until my seeing comes to a complete halt. Now, this restrain myself as if terrified, he's freezing. He's frozen in an activity where he's done it for 19 years because he knows how closely he has to look. And I think the idea of not necessarily freezing in terror, but as if terrified, going slowly where things really, really require scrutiny and care of action is what's being described here. And I like that until my seeing comes to a complete halt. I think there, and this is translated variously, other people talk about looking closely rather than seeing coming to a halt. Seeing coming to a halt might be the incorporation of mental models or getting so completely engrossed in what you're doing that it's just intuitive and there's no difference between seer and doer or object and subject, this type of thing. And then he says, my activity slows and the blade moves ever so slightly. And then, all at once, I find the ox already dismembered at my feet, like clumps of soil scattered on the ground. I retract the blade and stand there gazing at my work all around me, dawdling over it with satisfaction. Then I wipe the blade off and put it away. Now, then all at once, I find the ox dismembered at my feet. So this sounds like someone very much coming out of a state of flow. And if you think of, I can't pronounce it, but the author of Flow talking about this, when people are in these states, they're often quite unconscious, and then they come out of them and realize what they've done. This also really resonates with Berliner's description of an expert or someone acting almost on autopilot. So we can see this in a really, really telling passage from, the 4th century BCE. And I think that means a lot because this is cross-cultural. This isn't necessarily based on sort of research in Western contexts at a certain time in history. This shows that there might be something larger and broader to these notions and descriptions of expert practice. And then, of course, we get the king at the end, to a butcher who's probably covered with blood and gore. Wonderful. From hearing the cook's words, I have learned how to nourish life. So that's where we get to. And I want to conclude by talking about a couple of things. First, implications for editors, as promised in the title. To be a teacher embodying Wu Wei and to show expert practice, you'd have to be able to think in action, as Schön says, hyper-focus, and that's part of what Ericsson talks about, move freely in spaces of non-being, or see more closely. So that's involved, I think, with progressive problem solving. And then back to Ericsson, use mental models to recognize patterns in the classroom and respond unconsciously. And then to combine Schön and Ericsson, use representations for action with increasing sophistication. So this is how I think we should talk to teachers about their experience of teaching and what it would mean to embody expertise in the classroom. Now, because I'm a professional developer or an educational developer, I want to add, I have a few ideas here about how I might use this in my own practice, and definitely will in one of these ways. We could have staff create stories from their own practice as a novice teacher, and then 3 years later, and then 19 years later. And they could do that, just talking to one another or making short videos, this type of thing. In terms of an HEA accredited program, I might have people help cook Ding out by adding specific dimensions of the UK PSF to the story, which I'm sure some staff wouldn't like, but other staff would very much love and find the humor in, as well as learn from. And then, of course, a community of practice based around approaches to developing expertise in teaching, but in really anything, might be really beneficial to all staff, because that's about people's general development as well as their specific development in terms of classroom practice. And I have a bunch of references that you don't need to see now. So here again, my name and contact, I'm Charlie Reis, and thank you very much for listening.